Hi, everybody.
Excited for the session.
Oh,
Thank you for
great.
hosting, Sheila.
Yeah, thanks, Julie. Oh, my Zoom is freezing, but hopefully you can all hear and see me. I know we all have lots of questions and we have a lot of stuff that we want to share with you. So I do want to dive in as soon as we can. Oh my goodness, but my Zoom deciding it wants to be difficult. Uh, okay. I am just in case, Julie, I think I would like to make you a co-host, if that's
Mhm.
okay with you, just
Always.
so we don't lose everybody. I think is a smart idea. So let me do that right now. Oh boy, it's the perfect time for Zoom to decide it's going to be difficult with me. Okay, there we go. Okay, great. All right. So, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Sheila. I am the president and CEO of Signet Education. And today we are here to talk about the college essay, which I know drives everybody a little bit crazy. It feels like a lot of work and work that your student has probably never had to do before. So it feels unfair in that way. And we've all been dreading it probably for the last year. And now it's time to actually get started. So I'm glad you're here. We're going to try to give you as much practical advice and kind of ways to sort of orient yourself to this project that hopefully will put some of these worries aside and give you some tangible places to get started. So with that, I am going to share my screen. Oh, if Zoom wants to cooperate, please. I'm going to beg the technology gods to shine their favor on me. Oh no. Oh no. Oh no. Okay. Well, here we go. It's just a little delayed. Okay. Can everybody see my screen?
Perfectly.
Great. Okay. Well, I just have a few slides to share here, just to get ourselves kind of oriented to what are we here to talk about. So as I mentioned, we're here to talk about the college essay, and the essay is the place where your student can stand out in their college application, right? In a sea of other applications where the GPA may be similar, the specific courses may be similar, even some of the leadership might be similar. The essay is really where the student's unique voice can shine through. And it's such a huge opportunity to make that impression that really sets them apart from the rest of the competition. So this is a tremendous opportunity with a lot of potential, but you kind of need to know, what are we up against here? What are we trying to do so that you can make the most of it? And to be clear, we believe every student has this potential within them already. They may need some help uncovering it, articulating it, maybe even focusing a little bit. And sometimes bringing in a thought partner to work with them on this can be really helpful in excavating that potential and helping them get it on the page. So today I've got with you a couple of my esteemed colleagues. You can read the details, but I'll tell you a little bit about each of them. We have Joanna, who's a former Georgetown admissions officer. She is a consultant at Signet. And that means she kind of works from the strategic level of helping students develop their candidacy, build their college list, and decide kind of the strategy of the essays. How are they going to tie everything together? And what's the story that you're telling to a college? I have Satya, who, along with Jasper, is a writing specialist at Signet Education. And they're both, very highly educated, very talented writers. And they also have a lot of experience coaching students through this process in a way that helps them feel comfortable exploring topics that they might not have really thought deeply about before, and getting words on the page and, eventually structuring it into a beautiful essay that's polished and says exactly what they wanted to say. And so at Signet, most students who work with us work with both a consultant and a writing coach or a writing specialist to kind of bring this whole thing together. So you get to hear from a lot of really amazing people today. And before I stop my screen share and show you all their beautiful faces again, I mentioned I want to orient us a little bit to what are we talking about here? Most of you have probably heard of the college essay. We like to call it a personal statement. Sometimes it's the personal essay or the Common App essay. The Common Application is a very popular application platform that over 800 schools use. And if you're using that platform, your personal statement will go to all of the colleges that you're applying to. Some universities have their own application system, Georgetown, University of California, places like that, where you might have a slightly different structure of essays. But for the majority of colleges, you're going to have one main personal statement. And really, that's meant to be about the student and really kind of getting under the surface to understand their character, motivations, how they think, and these sort of intangible qualities that make them unique. And again, it goes to all the colleges. So it's not meant to be speaking to one specific college, but if you've built your college list right, there are going to be resonances across all of the colleges on your list that your personal statement could really speak to. In that way, be relevant and compelling to all of the colleges that the student is going to be sending this to. And that's 650 words. We'll talk about the prompts in just a second. 650 words may sound like a lot, but really it's like one page, single spaced. And that's not a lot of room to try to encapsulate all of these unique qualities about your student. And you also want to remember that the admissions officers are reading these things quite quickly. They're going through thousands of applications. So they're probably going to spend like 2 to 5 minutes on the personal statement. So it has to have an impact. Right. And we're going to talk today about how you can make sure it does have that. Then we have our supplemental essays. So not every college has these, but many selective colleges do. And these are essentially shorter, more specific prompts that ask about how the student is a match for the school. So it might be like, why are you applying to this school? Or respond to our mission statement? Or how are you going to contribute to our campus? And so these do need to be unique to each school, but students will know themselves, hopefully, and will understand, their academic interests or what they're looking for in their college. So there may be parts of these essays that they can reuse across all of the different colleges. Then they'll have to tailor it to fit the exact parameters of each school. So we are going to talk about both of these different essays in today's session. And it's important to know you don't want these to overlap. Whatever you've said in your personal statement, you don't want to repeat again in your supplemental essay, right? These are really potent opportunities, as I was saying, for a student to really stand out. So you want to make the most of that space. All right. And the last thing I'll share before we get into our questions, I kind of boiled down for us like the 4 pillars, maybe we'll call them, of college essay writing. And we do think about these things separately. When a student is writing, often they're kind of doing all of them at the same time. But when you're working with some kind of coach or an expert, we'll be thinking about each of these things. And I encourage you to think about how this plays out for your student. And I've just listed some questions here that can help orient you to what are we talking about for each of them. So the first is strategy. On a higher level, how does this essay highlight who the person of the application is? And a lot of admissions officers will say the essay really brings that student to life. It brings the whole application to life. So how can that essay serve that purpose? And then we also want to think about what are the particular values, strengths, or qualities we want to make sure the essay conveys, because it's not apparent from their extracurricular list or their list of transcripts, or it might not be something that the teachers are all going to be talking about in their recommendations, but we know this is something really special about this student that absolutely must be conveyed to the colleges with the application. That's kind of the strategy level. The content level of that is how do you demonstrate all of those things, right? The name of the game is show, not tell. So you want to be finding stories where a student has demonstrated that quality or even learned that strength or developed that value. And that's how you really convey the information, is through the stories. And what content in that regard would showcase the kind of way the student thinks and how they see the world, because that's what's going to help a college understand who the student is going to be on their campus. Then we have style. So I like to think of this as we have a toolbox, and how can we use those tools to create a compelling, coherent, and concise essay, right? 650 words. We can't waste any of those words. We need to make sure the pieces all hang together and that it resonates with the reader, right? And there are lots of ways to do this. You can use dialogue, you can use flashbacks, you can use flash forwards, you can use, a third person narrator, you can do all sorts of things. And that's where having someone who really knows the craft of writing can be very helpful in conducting this or completing this project with your child. And then finally, we have voice. And voice is tied in a little bit with style, but we really want to make sure that the student's unique voice is coming across. Now, this could be showcasing elements of their personality in the stories they're telling. It could be their specific choice of vocabulary or sentence structure that just reflects the way that they talk, even though the essay needs to be, slightly more elevated than conversational. It doesn't have to be super formal. And how can we use that voice to create really memorable connections with the reader? Because at the end of the day, that's what you want. You want the admissions officer to remember your student and feel like they know them in some way. And the best way to do that is to tap into that really differentiated individual voice. Okay, I've been rambling. I'm going to stop my share now and we're going to go into our questions. And what I would love to do is have Joanna tell us a little bit about the purpose of the personal statement and really how admissions officers tend to look at this when they're doing the evaluation process.
Sure. Well, thank you, Sheila. It's a pleasure to be here. When I talk to students about the personal statement, I describe it oftentimes as sort of the flagship. It's sort of the flagship product within this portfolio that they're submitting. Because when you think about it, your application really is very much like a jigsaw puzzle. You have all of these elements, you have grades, you have clubs, you have titles, you have all of these things that you've done, test scores potentially, letters of recommendation. Everything needs to fit together nice and neatly, but there needs to be one central element that sort of anchors everything together. And that really is the personal statement. And so to give you an example, my background is in marketing and branding. And so I tell my students that if you think about sort of the elements of building a brand, you think about expertise, purpose, and authenticity. And expertise, those are the things that you're good at. And that's the stuff that shows up in your grades, in the test scores, in the letters of rec. It's purpose and authenticity that is given a place to shine in the personal statement, because that really is an opportunity to talk about what are the things that get you out of bed in the morning? What drives you? What makes you uniquely you? It really does allow you to become a much more three-dimensional person to the admissions committee, and allows you to stand out. So, schools probably are getting tens of thousands of students who love computer science and maybe play soccer and have joined chorus and maybe fill in the blank other organization. The way that you start standing out, you start adding those layers. So if computer science is something that you're really good at, but maybe it doesn't necessarily get you out of bed in the morning. Maybe it's going out and cleaning up trash on the beach because you recognize that saving the planet and the environment is something you really are you are really drawn to and driven about. Maybe you overlay that with the fact that part of what makes you uniquely you is that you care about the small little things. You care about doing the things that no one's asking you to do and just sort of showing up. Now that's starting to give you a little bit more of a personality. And so admissions officers are looking for all of those elements in the personal statement. They want to understand the student behind the grades, the student behind all of those test scores. And it really is a wonderful opportunity to what I always tell students to show, not tell. And you can demonstrate that through storytelling, through all these wonderful techniques that Sheila and my colleagues are going to chat about further this afternoon.
Thanks, Joanna. I kind of want to open up to the group because as I mentioned, the stories are the most important part. And I want to hear some stories from all of you, your favorite parts, maybe most memorable essays that you've worked on with students and some of the transformations that you've helped facilitate through the writing process. Satya, how about we start with you?
Absolutely. Good evening, everyone. It's great to see you. I think one of my favorite stories was a student who was going into robotics. And the reason she got into robotics was because she was a fencer. And so she, during the pandemic, wasn't able to practice in the way that she wanted to. And instead of saying, oh no, I guess I'll take up jigsaw puzzles or something instead, she's like, I want to design a robot where I can practice this. And that was her entire journey into joining the robotics club and discovering that, oh, this is a bit disorganized and there are not a lot of people that look like me. It wasn't a very gender diverse space. And I don't like the way that this is organized in that I want to be on the mats with the rest of the robotics club operating the robot and programming and doing all these things. And the way that the entire team was structured was very much about a single person who had all the information and everyone else kind of just cheering them on. And so her story evolved into this amazing narrative of like being a first year student, showing up in high school and being like, hey, I think we can do more. I think we can do better. And her spending time during the pandemic creating reference material so that everyone could know how to operate the machine, and ending kind of with the story of like, I have a prototype. Like I built a robot that I can, that's not great, but that's more than a lot of folks are doing. And part of what I think is also really funny about this story is a little bit of an aside that may appeal to you, is that deep into the process, we're like polishing it. Her mother reached out and was like, you know, this is great. And also maybe it should be about violin. And we were like, wait, what? And she was like, yeah, like you do the violin and you did America's Got Talent. Like, why aren't we talking about that? And it was like such a really good contrast to see like how a parent sees their student versus how the student sees themselves and what's important to them. So like we did end up sticking with the robots, but it was just like a really amazing experience to see her be like, Mom, no, I don't play the violin anymore. Like I want to talk about robots. And that's where we landed, and she landed in a really great spot. And it kind of was just one of the more unique stories that I've encountered in my tenure at Signet, and it's just a really lovely story.
Satya, I love you sharing that story and the kind of the sigma between what the parent thought the story was and what the child was leading with. And Joanna, when I was hearing you describe, you know, that this is the way that students are able to express their uniqueness, their unique qualities, to become more than their test scores and their CV. I think that that can sometimes be really intimidating to students and to parents, because it's like, you have, like Sheila said, 650 words, you have this one shot. And I've definitely had a number of students come in and be like, okay, so you should know, I'm not interesting at all, but don't worry, I'm going to make something up. And I mean, transparently, that's not a great approach to creating a compelling piece of writing. Also, it definitely like overestimates your ability to con other people and underestimates other people's like BS alarms. But what I love, one of the things that I love, kind of like you echoing Satya's story, is when a student comes in and they're like, I'm pretty sure I want to tell this story. And like, sometimes I struggle to know why they want to tell the story. So last year I was working with a student who was like, the story that I want to tell is, I got a summer job working at a golf course and I was so good at it. I would talk up all the, I would drive the golf cart and I'd talk up the guys who I was caddying for. And I got to know like dozens of guys. And isn't that interesting? And I had to say, like, I'm definitely interested why you want to tell this story, but I don't know that the story itself has you've unpacked it enough to figure out why it's interesting. And so we just kind of kept talking about it. We did some exploratory writing, and eventually it kind of came out that over the pandemic, he had developed a really intense like video game dependency, that he was dealing with a lot of stress in his family. And he had kind of set himself to go work at this golf course this summer, and he left his video game rig at home, and it had opened up like this new vista for him. His grades had all gone up, and he had kind of overcome that social anxiety. And so as we kept working on it, the golf course part became like 3 sentences, but it turns out he was pointing at the right thing. This is what matters to me. Like Satya, like you were saying, like, no, the America's Got Talent, the violin thing, that's not it. Like he knew what the story was, but he hadn't sat with it long enough. And I was glad to hold that space for him.
I love that story so much. I think it's so representative of like what can happen in the best of all possible cases, right? Like you allow a teenager to believe in themselves in a very real way. And it's so empowering. I really love it. Joanna, before we move on, any stories you want to tell?
Sure. I think there's students always ask, like, what are the no-nos? Like there have to be things that are too cliche. And so similar to Satya and Jasper, I've had students who have come in and said, I really want to talk about how when my lacrosse team lost the state championship, it was just the most devastating thing in the entire world that happened to me, and my life ended. And I always have to take a pause and remind myself, we were all 15, 16, 17 once. And at that moment in your ecosystem, that may be the end all be all. But very much like Jasper's story, I think it's important to give students the space to process some of that, because I also think that so many of these children are so overscheduled, they're so hyper focused, you just have to move on from one thing to the next. And so many of them have oftentimes not had a chance to really think about the impact that these events have had on them. And so while I think you'll hear a lot of folks say that, stay away from things that could feel cliche about, losing a state championship, for this student in particular, we really dug in to try to understand why this was such a big deal. And I found out it wasn't that he was captain of the team or was even particularly good. He actually wasn't even a starter on the team, but it was so devastating to him because his role on the team was he was the hype person. He was the one who made everyone feel good. And he was the one who gave everyone a reason to believe. And in his mind, he saw it as a personal failure that he had not done his job appropriately in lifting people up to believe that they could be successful. And that, and I won't go into too much more detail, but, it was more about really discovering what's at the root. The state championship loss was just the way it manifested. It was sort of the vehicle. And to Jasper's point in his story, it ended up being just that. It was maybe a 2-sentence footnote almost, but the story ended up being much more focused on how he really derives energy and how he sort of grew and felt good when he made other people feel good. And that, I think, again, going back to this idea of showing, not telling, I think that was really powerful to show that this is the kind of person he would be on a university campus. He talked in a subsequent essay about how, he's that person who's going to run around with a red clown nose on during finals week and handing out cookies and making people feel good, because that's how he fills his own cup. And that's the kind of person I think a lot of schools would want to have on their campus, lifting others up.
So fantastic. I just love hearing these stories. And I'm sure you see us, we're smiling so hard because this is the stuff that fills our cup. We love working with teenagers to excavate these stories and help them see just how amazing they are. All right, let's go to Jasper and let's talk about the prompts a little bit. And I'll put the link to the Common App prompts in the chat so you can look at them. But Jasper will tell you they're very open. Jasper, what do you think?
Yes, that is the first thing that I always say when I'm sitting down and looking at prompts with students. Students have almost always looked at the prompts before, have some ideas. And what I always say is these prompts are here to help you. They are nobody is quizzing you. Nobody is going to grade you on how well you stacked up against other people who answered that prompt. They are absolutely a gift from the College Board, which doesn't, or from the Common App people to students. And the reason that is that a lot of times when we think about presenting our own stories, we start from things that will paint us in a really good light, or maybe things off of our CV that are impressive. And to the point of helping people actually get to know you, helping people root for you, that actually is not always the best approach. And I think it was Joanna who's saying it's much better to show, don't tell. That's kind of a cliche, but to tell a story. And I, having worked with these prompts for a lot of time, I've noticed that most of them, let me just say at the outset, the 7th prompt is as open-ended as any prompt has ever been. So even if you deviate from one of the prompts a little bit, it always is okay. There's no topic that isn't okay. There's a topic that would probably get you not admitted, but not for not following the prompt. So, but looking at the other prompts that are a little bit less open-ended, a lot of them have this same pattern of something happened. So it's you encountered an obstacle, or you questioned or challenged a belief, or somebody did something for you that made you happy. But then they generally ask a couple of questions, because then it asks you, what did you do in response? What action did you take out of this external stimulus or this event that happened? You did something in response. And then it usually has this third part, which is now that you're looking back on it, what lessons did you take away? And I think it's really useful when framing stories of like personal growth or something that reveals something inside you, to show you encountering an obstacle or wrestling with an idea. But I think it's also really important that that thing that happened is usually framed by these questions as being something in the past. So sometimes students come in and they have an idea for an essay, and it's something that is still going on or that just started a month ago. And I often say, like, well, look at these prompts. Like, they're not really asking, like, what's this thing that you got excited about last week? Not that that thing you're excited about last week isn't going to impact your life massively. That may be the thing that decides the entire rest of the course of your life, but it's not digested enough. Like, there's, it's kind of like, digesting is maybe not the best metaphor, but like with these stories that we're telling, it's often really useful if we have already kind of gotten to the end of that story, even though that can feel like, oh, well, this happened like 3 years ago. It's like, well, we're going to get you today thinking and processing this. So you're going to be in it, this current you, but also that actually can show like a full cycle of problem, wrestling with the problem, resolving the problem or the idea, and kind of integrating it into the self and then reflecting on it. So I that's a pretty useful model to me to kind of make sense of these questions that on their face can look like they're, you know, kind of a scattershot bunch of different ways that it's going.
Thanks, Jasper. That's really helpful. And then staying in on the practical mode, Satya, how do we even start? Like, how do we choose a topic? What kind of brainstorming do we do? Like, it feels overwhelming. So where do we begin?
Yeah, sometimes there being so many possibilities can be like, oh no, where do I start? And so a lot of things that I like to keep in mind with my students is, one, this is a marathon, not a sprint. So I need you to pick something, like to Jasper's point, not that you really loved last week, because I don't know if that's going to be the story in 2 months, and we're still going to be talking about this essay in 2 months. I need you to talk about something that you love or that has mattered to you and has impacted you in a really deep way, so that when we're still editing this essay in a few weeks, you're not just like so upset that I even have to bring it up. So that's one of the very first things. I'll just ask students, like, what do you love? Like, what clubs are you in? How do you spend your time? What do you geek out about? Because we all have those things. And then also there are other exercises that we can do, like bring 3 objects to us and tell me the story of them and why they're meaningful to you. Or like, who in your life has inspired you and why? Like, what changes have you seen? And to echo Jasper's point, I feel like a lot of these essays are these stories of growth, of adaptability for someone so young, of like developing that self-awareness that they maybe haven't had to demonstrate before in their writing classes. Usually it's like, I read this book and now I have some thoughts and I'm going to share them with you. But that deeper level of reflection of like, how has this changed my perspective? Or how is this going to influence how I move forward? Hasn't happened yet. And so I try to get them thinking about the things that they're going to just want to tell me about. And we can kind of pick through the story that has that nice arc of beginning, middle, and end. And that's why I'm here today. And that's why you need me on your campus. And often it's like, it's not always the big things, to Joanna's point. It's not always like the devastating loss. Like sometimes it's like, I had one student who started her essay about a worry doll that like her mother had given her when she was very small. And she just kept it because when she was anxious at night, she was able to tell it her worries and go to sleep. And it's like, that's like a small thing, but it spoke to her culture, it spoke to her connections, and it spoke to the fact that, hey, I now know this about myself. I'm an anxious person. Here's how I'm managing that and how I'm still able to get up and go, in her case, like perform on stage in front of my entire school at this like dance recital kind of thing. And those stories are just so impactful. It's not always the really flashy things, like Jasper said. It's not always like, and I won this huge trophy and this prize, and I'm like the all-star. It's like the moments, not necessarily the stuff you make a memoir about.
I love that. Anybody have something to add to that, Joanna or Jasper?
I was going to just jump in with another example of a student who I was working with who it was something really small, sort of like you were saying, Satya, but he was just like really interested in space and was like interested in maybe working in like aeronautics or really gifted like science minded person. And I mean, it's not always where you like keep pushing and it reveals something deeper, but he pretty quickly was like, the real reason I like space is that like I have ADHD diagnosed, and when I think about, the theory of space-time and like solve equations in that have to do with this, like I am able to focus for hours at a time, and it feels really good. And I use that actually in like my math or my English classes. I'll like write down an equation or solve some equation for like a body in orbit, and that'll help me focus. And so kind of like your student addressing anxiety, like knowing enough about themselves to know that they have a tendency towards anxiety, and to have kind of developed a skill. I feel like that kind of self-awareness is such a gift in anybody who you might work with or have as a student. And I sometimes caution students against writing about like their experience of depression or something that might set off an alarm bell in a university, in somebody doing admissions, like, oh, we already have a mental health crisis on campus. The student's telling us they have a mental health problem. But I think that if it's the right story and it's told the right way, it can only help your application.
I couldn't agree more, Jasper. I was just going to add to that. I think that there are definitely some exercises that, you touched beautifully on this as well. I think there's certainly exercises you can do with students to also start teasing out some of that, because for every student who is incredibly self-aware and knows these things, there are probably 10 or 15 who come and go, I don't know what's special about me, or it's the, hey, I'm good at comp sci and I'm a pretty good soccer player and I've been playing the piano for 15 years, but only because my mom made me. Asking for a friend, right? But what I will say, so one of the things that I have students do is, I mentioned sort of the idea of expertise, authenticity, and purpose. And so I have my students go off and do an exercise where I ask them to write down 2 or 3 things that they are really good at, and to think about what are the things that you believe you're good at versus what are the things that people tell you you're good at. And then the next step of that is for the purpose part, because I think this can be tough. And I think, Tia, you had mentioned this earlier, this idea of, what do you do in your free time? So I always ask students, because, again, every student's dramatically overscheduled. I tell them, let's imagine you have a free day. So you wake up, you don't have any classes, you have no responsibility whatsoever. There's no part-time job, there are no siblings, there are no chores, there's nothing. You have a genuine free day. How are you going to spend your time? And it's always amazing to me to see, number one, how many kids will fumble with this, because just the thought of having a free day is completely foreign. But when you actually get them to start thinking about how would they choose to spend their time if they had that luxury, it's incredibly telling, because you start looking for these themes. And that's really what you'll start to see here, is then when you layer on this idea of authenticity, I ask students, go and ask people in 4 different circles in your life what 3 words they would use to describe you. So ask your best friend, ask a teacher, ask a coach, ask your parents, ask a sibling, because chances are, you're probably going to get some variation on those words, because, let's be honest, we all are, I think, especially as teenagers, we're all slightly different versions of ourselves, depending on who we're interacting with. But you'll start seeing those themes. And I think that's where a coach can really come in handy, whether it's a strategist or a writing specialist, because being a third party or someone who knows the student, but is also a little bit removed, we can sort of see those themes and those threads and start kind of tugging on them a little bit more. So, okay, so I see that you are an extrovert with your family, you're an introvert in this particular situation, but the common thread at the end of the day is you really enjoy doing nice things for people, and you don't feel compelled to get the credit. Like, you really are just a giver or doer, and you like to show up. And so so let's dig into that a little bit further. And so I love giving students the opportunity to start, again, sort of discovering a little bit more about themselves, even if they're not always able to do so organically on their own. And I think, again, the personal statement's a great opportunity to do some of this soul searching. And quite frankly, I think that a lot of the things that students discover are going to help them not only on their application, but also as they go off into college and go into their adult life, because these are really, for some kids, I think these are really sort of earth-shattering revelations sometimes.
Sheila, you're muted.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, my Zoom is acting up. So I appreciate you all bearing with me. So in the interest of time, I want to pivot. We'll come back and talk about the supplemental essays, because I think a lot of the same things apply. It's just with a much more specific prompt and purpose of articulating the match. But let's talk about like the role of a parent, right? I mean, you gave us an example of a parent coming in trying to like, bulldoze a prompt through or a topic through. But there are productive roles for parents to play in this process, and I'm sure everyone here would love to hear about that. So, Jasper, what do you think? What role can a parent play here?
I mean, I love having parents. I think when I started doing this work like a decade ago, sometimes parents would be like, I want to sit down on one of the sessions, and I would be like a little concerned, but I've come around to really feeling like parents are often their child's best advocate, and they know their kids so well and are so often see the good where the child has a more ambivalent relationship with their own abilities. And so I think that the parent can really help. Sometimes I've had students when they're doing like some of the exercises Joanna was describing of like generating ideas, like what is the story? I'll say like, go ask your parent, like, what are 3 of the stories that you think say the most about me? And I think that they can be really useful then. Now, I would say there does exist like the helicopter parent, as sometimes described, or just somebody who has some reservation or disinclination to let their kid kind of go off on a journey of writing without being constantly supervised. And I think that in my experience, that is almost always the reason why they've come to work with Signet, is that they know this about themselves. And so they're hiring somebody to like to create a buffer and hold some space for their kid to find their own story. So then I try and do that for myself. But I always think that there's a magic moment, especially when a kid has found maybe something about themselves that they maybe didn't know or hadn't expressed as clearly before. And when they bring that essay back to their parents and say like, Mom, will you read this? That is often like the sweetest moment. That said, I did once have a student who wrote her whole essay about her family home burning down when she was a freshman in high school, and they were all in the house and they like all got out, their pets were all okay, but they lost all of their possessions. And throughout the whole engagement, the parents would occasionally hop on the call and be like, we saw the latest draft, and just so you know, this actually didn't have any impact on the kids. We managed it really well, and it was all okay. So I don't really know what she's writing about here. And it was my place. I kind of ended up being a little bit of the interpreter to be like, actually, I think you should just read what's happening and kind of trust this process as she's, and I think this is a little off topic, but sometimes whenever you're doing writing, tutoring, or teaching, you end up in a role that is somewhat therapeutic, where you're helping hold space for somebody to explore a story. And I have on a few occasions just recommended, like, you should actually have a therapist. I'm not trained to work with this. But on many occasions, it can be wonderful to get to tell your own story in your own words. That didn't really cohere into one answer, but is maybe 3 interesting.
We're following you though. No, that's really great. I think the trust is really a key piece of this. I really encourage parents to have an explicit agreement with their student, their teenager, about when they are going to look at the essay, what kind of feedback they are going to give at what stage of the writing process. And parents, you just really need to know that the first stage of this, your student has to be really vulnerable and be okay trying things on and not feel like everything is up for evaluation yet, because we've got months before the deadlines, right? We're still going to be working on this. And so sometimes that critical feedback is not that useful at the beginning, but suggesting ideas might be, right? Without poo-pooing whatever they're working on. But then later in the process, that's the place for, this phrasing may be a little clunky, or maybe we can elevate the language here or something like that, right? So there's different kinds of feedback that you want to give at different points in the process. And to that end, I'd love to hear some of the ideas about revising essays, right? There's one thing to come up with the topic and to start writing, right? We know the first draft is going to be your worst draft. It's supposed to be. It's going to get better from there. So how do you improve it? How do you go about revising this thing? Satya.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, I'm guilty of it myself. When I was in high school, there was a lot of essays I wrote the night before, and revision is not a thing I did. So the step one is talking to students and being like, this is not a last minute exercise. This is something that we are going to be talking about for a long time. And revision means that we're going to be taking a step back emotionally in some ways, and then critically looking at it and seeing, is this clear? Is this persuasive? Is this making the argument that I am adaptable and fun and that you want me on campus because I'm really smart and I'm going to change the world when I get older? I'm going to, run for president or whatever it is they're going to do. And that it's going to be very iterative. And so I love the pillars that we showed earlier, because really what we're doing as we revise is that in the early stages, we're really going to be seeing, does this tell a coherent story that someone who's reading very quickly and probably loved reading these essays 2 weeks ago and now is 2000 in and maybe doesn't love them as much, is really going to speak to? They're going to be able to pick it up really quickly. A lot of times in the revision process, someone has kind of like a big story that they want to tell, but it requires a lot of nuance. And then they don't have nuance that they can offer in 650 words. And so kind of like Jess's story earlier, like, it's like, wait, what is the story here? Like, what is the actual narrative? So early on, we're just getting on like, what are the big points that we have to hit? What are the arguments that we're making, and how is each paragraph going to hit those? And then we're really rereading it. We're talking through it. We're questioning every word choice, every image, to see if it's conveying what we want. And also, are there images that we could use that might express the point we're trying to make in fewer words? So like in my background, I study metaphors. That is literally what my dissertation is on. I love metaphors. And so one that just popped into my head with the student was that her art teacher took away her eraser because she kept erasing and doing it over and erasing and doing the same line over because she felt like she couldn't draw a perfect flower. And her teacher took away that eraser to say, it is perfect the way you drew it. Like, it is your style, it is your interpretation, it is art. Make the mistake and keep it moving. And so it was like the story about earning back her eraser, which like, that's an image that packs so much into it. And so how can we express these ideas in ways that are easy to pick up, that are accessible to anyone? And then eventually we're going to get to commas and like split infinitives and all the things that like personally I don't recommend a student have to memorize. We have so many other tools to get at all the grammar rules. But it's very, very iterative and collaborative and sometimes fun. Like that's the other thing. Like I know we are moved on from this question, but like I think parents can help us embrace this as like a fun process. It's the beginning of going to college. That's huge. And so like not always treating it as this like really, really high stakes thing that we have to take seriously. I've had parents comment to be like, who are you talking to? Oh, I'm talking to Sia. Isn't she teaching you, right? Yes, and it's still fun. Like, so that's something to take away from it.
That's great. All right. I want to make sure we leave enough time for questions. So maybe I'll ask one more question of the group here. How do we know when we're done with an essay? Joanna, do you want to chime in?
Yeah, I think that's such a tough question, because I think especially if you are the parent of a high performing child, they're going to tell you that it's never going to be done. It's never going to be perfect. And I think that's actually when you get to a point in the process where, and this is where I think an outside party can help, where it feels like you're starting to sort of circle the drain a little bit, where you're wordsmithing the same words over and over again. I think it means that the content is set, and that it is okay getting it out the door. I always ask students at the very beginning of an engagement, when I first meet them, to send over the standard things like their transcripts and their test scores. But then I also ask them to send me a writing sample, send me a paper that you've written in the last 6 months. And it needs to, ideally, it should be one that's not perfect. I don't want a 100 paper. I want a paper that really reflects sort of who you are as a person, what your writing style is. And I always sort of tuck that away to just give me a sense of what is that student's voice? What is their style? And I think for me, at least personally, that's really helpful in the process to sort of know when to say we're done, because I think you do get to a point of sort of where you're having diminishing returns, where you start polishing to the point where it doesn't sound like the student's voice anymore. It starts to sound like someone else's. And that I think can be just as detrimental, if not more so. So I think the answer is it's a bit of a self-awareness exercise, but I think this is especially where a third party can really come in handy to really sort of be able to tap them on the shoulder and say, hey, we're good. We're good. We have to put the pencils down. Or if you like Top Chef, it's, time's up and the hands have to go up. So
right. Well, I want to open it up for questions. I definitely have more things that we can all talk about, but attendees, if you want to put your questions in the chat or come off mute, you're welcome to ask any questions you want about any part of this writing process. And while we're waiting for some questions to come in, I wonder if we can talk a little bit about how to keep everything organized and how to build some accountability into this process and what kind of timeline you might recommend. Satya, I saw you nodding vigorously, so I'm going to let you answer that.
I love spreadsheets. So we have a lot of spreadsheets where we're keeping track of which schools the students applying to, what are the due dates, when we want to have drafts, and what are the prompts, because this is definitely an eco-friendly process. We want to reuse and recycle as much as we can. They don't need to write the same essay. Like for all these different schools, we want to make sure we have pieces that are core that we can tweak a little bit. And so keeping all that organized in a spreadsheet and then really asking the student, like, what works best for you? I've had students who are like, I want to meet once a week and I don't want to hear from you in the interim. I have other ones who are like, I love a text message. I would love if you could review the draft in advance. It's all very tailored to what that specific student thrives with. And that's, I think, the easiest timeline. But we do start in the summer before a regular decision and early action.
Yeah, I think just having a timeline is a good idea. Like, let's start there, the basics. But yeah, you can get really fancy with your spreadsheets. Kalpana asks, what are clear things that make an essay seem inauthentic? Are there generally things to stay away from, or is everything okay as long as the student generally believes in it? And maybe you meant genuinely believes in it, because I think we want genuine, not general belief. Jasper, what do you think?
Yeah, I'll jump in and say that I think authenticity is kind of an imaginary idea that doesn't really exist in the real world. All writing is, to some degree or another, a performance. And the question is, does this performance, when you read it, feel like you, the student? And I've definitely sometimes worked with a student just once or twice, and I never really get to know them enough to really know if that is being achieved. But certainly parents generally can tell, like, this sounds like my kid. I see my kid here. This does, or like, was this written by ChatGPT, which is my favorite new writing insult. Yeah.
Oh, no.
Okay, let's avoid that one. We got some other great questions here. Do you think all essays have to have a story? Can this too seem too canned?
I'll jump in for oh, go ahead, Satya.
No, go ahead, Joanne, you're good.
Oh, there's a clarifying question. Remember back a few years ago where there was a trend with these essays with a hard story or coming of age event that they've overcome?
I think that was called the trauma essay, right?
Yeah.
From a couple of years ago. No, and I think, Carla, to your question, I mean, I don't think that essays need to have an essay. I mean, we're talking about perfectly imperfect people. So there isn't a nice, clean beginning, middle, and conclusion. It's not a fairy tale because the story, the fact of the matter is the student's story is still being written. But I will say, I do think that there needs to be some sort of narrative piece within an essay, because I have had students who have tried to do some more abstract things where they want to talk about a handful of things. And this is what I sometimes start calling the kitchen sink, because the essay becomes a dumping ground. It's just, they want to throw everything in there, and it feels a little bit more, and maybe I'm dating myself, but it reminds me of that show from the 80s, Columbo, where he would always be like, but there's just one more thing. And after a while, when you start adding these things, it's not necessarily cohesive. So I do think you need at least a core idea. Again, that doesn't have to be a nice and neat story, but there needs to be something that ties it all together. So I talked a little bit earlier about themes, and maybe it's a theme that has maybe two parts to it, maybe a third, depending on how efficient you are with words. But there should be some sort of unifying element, because even if it all makes sense sort of in the student's head, it's not always going to manifest itself out that way in the essay. And it's really important to realize, Sheila, you had mentioned this earlier, on average, admissions officers are spending 2 to 5 minutes on applications. I think the other deep, dirty secret that I will share from my days of reading applications is that in an ideal world, and I tell every student this, you want to believe that the admissions officer reading your application is reading at 9 a.m. on a Monday after they're well rested and they have a cup of coffee in their hand and the world is wonderful. But the reality is they're probably going to be essays that they read, applications that they read at 3 a.m. after they've had 6 Red Bulls, and all they want to do is go to bed. And so, but they're still going to give that application its due moments. But you need to be thoughtful in terms of the potentially the mindset of the person on the receiving end. And that part of that is just luck of the draw. So the more that you can do to give the reader something that they can easily follow and that feels, again, consistent with the rest of what you're presenting in your application, that is, I mean, you're just doing yourself favors at that point. So just make sure that you're trying to help the reader and help the admissions officer who's on the receiving end as much as possible.
Yeah. And like Jasper mentioned, you really want them rooting for you, right? So you've got to give them something to root for, right? A reason for them to root for you. I will also add that the reason we talk about stories is because when we don't, students are often like, here's a general life lesson. They like state it like a proverb almost. And we're like, well, but if you can put this in a story when this actually happened to you, or how you learned this lesson, or, you know, how you applied this lesson to your, math Olympiad team afterwards, then we take something from being generic that literally anybody can say and being something that only you can say, and it revealing something about you in particular. I often tell my students, we kind of know we're done when, if you were to print out your essay and it didn't have your name on it or any other identifying information on it, but you dropped it in the hallway of your school, everyone would know it was your essay because it sounds like you, it feels like you, it just is you, right? It's a snapshot, but it's you. Great. Another question here. How many essay versions should a student prepare on average? I think maybe how many revisions do we want to go through? What do you think?
Actually, the question is, you said something about potentially needing to answer different prompts, or there being school-specific essays that should not be the same as personal statements. So how many should the students prepare?
So that actually depends on how many schools you're applying to and what questions those schools ask, right? So as you build your college list, you're going to want to add them to the Common Application platform. There are a lot of sites out there that will aggregate and tell you, these are all the supplemental essays for University of Maryland, and these are the ones for Carnegie Mellon. But sometimes those are not always up to date. So I always recommend adding your schools to the Common Application, filling in all the demographic and like the timing information of when you want to enroll. And then the application will tell you the questions, the additional questions that the college is going to be asking. And depending on how many schools you apply to, you could be writing, 50 versions of these essays, because some schools, particularly highly selective schools, are asking 8, 9, 10 additional questions. Some of them are short, 25 words, and some of them are going to be 400-word essays. Some of them will be 650-word essays. So it all depends on the schools that you end up applying to.
Students to do as well is that, like, when they write that first draft, there's usually like 6 stories in there. Like, to Joanna's point, like, they're covering a whole lot of ground, and I'm just like, we don't throw anything away. Like, we have these like holding documents where it's like, oh yeah, I want to tell this story, I want to tell this idea. They can often come back up in the supplemental essays, and that's where we'll get to showcase those important moments that just don't cohere as nicely or hang as nicely in the primary essay. College student first statement.
Yeah. Carla has another really great question. Carla coming with all the good questions tonight. She's asking, is the essay about why a particular major, is that a good topic, or is that too old school? I usually recommend looking at the supplemental essays for your colleges before you choose, because again, you don't want them to overlap. And many schools do ask about an academic interest. And so you want to save that material for a supplemental essay and write your main essay about something else. Right. But if it so happens that you're applying to colleges that either don't have supplemental essays or don't ask that specific question, then that's a perfectly good topic for your main essay. But looking at the prompts will also help. Kristen asked, do the supplemental essays get updated or change when the Common App updates between July and August? Yes, they do. Actually, August 1st is when every college is supposed to have their updated supplemental essays in. Now, usually these things don't change very much year to year. Last year, we saw a bunch of changes. particularly in response to the Supreme Court decision barring race-conscious admissions practices. So we did see some new questions and some things swapped out or some wording changes. But usually what we end up doing is pulling last year's questions and having students start to brainstorm and write on those, because once you start looking at these supplemental essay prompts, you'll see they're like 6 or 7 main questions that they're really asking in different languages, or different language, not languages, different wording of the prompt itself, and usually different length of question, but they're about the academic interest, or why do you want to go to this school, or how are you going to contribute on campus? Tell us about a meaningful extracurricular. Tell us about a time you had a disagreement with somebody and how did you manage it, and things like that. Oh, some really good questions. Should a student include metrics to support the depth and reach of a program that they created? Sandy, this might be more appropriate for the activity list section of the essay. Metrics are great there. But Joanna, do you want to chime in about including metrics in an essay?
Sure. I mean, I think it's important to remember that, the essay, again, these are personal essays. And so at the end of the day, I mean, there's certainly things that could strengthen the argument you're trying to make, but these are not research papers like a student would write for high school. And so what I usually encourage students to do is, if there are things they want to share, I ask them about qualitative results. So if they've created a nonprofit, or if they've started a new initiative, what is the impact that's been created? Again, to Sheila's point, I think that the activity list is a great place to list all of those metrics, all of those numbers. But the essay is a great place to then talk about sort of the softer, squishier stuff. What is the impact that you've had on people? Because again, I think this also then speaks, as an admissions officer, they're reading this thinking about, well, if this is the impact you've had on people's lives, on communities, this is how you're going to show up in our community.
I would add to that I think like specifics and details are so wonderful when we're reading anything. And so I think if you are taking as your topic, like I had a student who like set up a TED Talk program at their high school, and they were like so excited about it. And so we did include, there were like 35 talks and over 400 students attended. Those metrics were interesting, but they were also like one sentence worth. The others were specifics about working with people late at night and, the one they were most excited about.
Thank you, Desper. All right. If we don't have any other questions, I think we'll wrap up. All of you will receive some follow-up with the recording and an additional sort of set of, we're calling it a mini training on how to move through the essay process and things that you should be watching out for. I also, if my screen share will work, it looks like it will not. I'll send you this in an email, but I'm opening up time on my calendar for a 1-hour strategy session around the essay, but if you have other questions, we'll deal with that as well. And it's at a heavily discounted rate from my normal rate. So you'll get some more information about that as well. Thank you so much for spending some time with us. We really enjoyed talking about our favorite students. I hope you enjoyed hearing about them. Take care, everybody.